Hello, my friend. Welcome to your sleep story. My name is Stephen Dalton. I'm an Irish storyteller, and it's my great privilege to be the voice that you listen to as you go to sleep tonight. Tonight I continue my incredibly dull history series, and tonight we will learn about the history of air travel. I've always loved taking planes, and even in this world of low-cost airlines, for me, there is still great romance and mystery about flying through the sky and seeing the clouds around you. I really hope you like this one. And one small thing, if you'd like to support my work, you can do so on Patreon. The link is below this video. Okay, let's do the relaxation session now, which will take a few minutes before tonight's sleep story. I'm going to count down from 10 to 1, and as I do, allow yourself to let go more and more. 10. Feel the support of the bed beneath you, or the floor, or whatever you lie upon tonight. Really feel that support. And beneath all of that, there is the support of the earth, our home, our constant support. And notice that the more you become aware of that support, the more you can let go. The more you can sink into this moment. 9. You are safe. Know that tonight my voice is nothing but a friend, a guide of kindness that will only ever take you to safe places. Allow my voice to be an anchor of peace, guiding you to beautiful, wondrous places. 8. Become aware of your body now. And as you do, just become aware of your breath for a moment. Perhaps take a deep breath in through your nose when you're ready. And breathe out when you're ready. And maybe another deep breath. In. And out. And as you become aware of that breath, the breathing out, with each out-breath, let go a little more. Maybe move through your body Check where you're holding tension or pain. Maybe it's in your feet, your lower legs, your thighs, your belly, your chest, your back, or shoulders, your hands, your arms, your neck, or maybe you're like me. Do you hold the tension in your face? Just let it all go now. 7. The day is done. Whatever has been, has been. Whatever will be, will be. Whatever thoughts you may be having, don't fight them. Just see them for what they are. Thoughts. A symptom of being human. And as they arrive, welcome them. And then just let them go. Watch them float away like leaves on a moonlit river, or clouds passing through a starlit sky. Six. This is your moment. This is your time. You deserve rest. You deserve peace. There is nowhere to be now. Nowhere to go. No obligations. Absolutely nothing to do but settle into this moment. Five. Peace lives within you. It is always there. It's just waiting to be found, waiting to be felt. Maybe you can find it tonight. Maybe you can journey to that peace with your mind's eye now. Maybe you find it in your chest, or in your head. Wherever you might find it, know that it's a constant friend. For perhaps feel a little gratitude now. Gratitude for the simple things, for the shelter you have tonight, whatever it may be. For the use of your body, for the ability to just lie here and listen to a sleep story. For those you love and who love you, know that you are loved, whoever you are and wherever you are tonight. Three. Begin to engage with your imagination now. Begin to feel curious. One of the nicest states to be in your mind. To be curious to learn and be ready to also perhaps have a little smile on your face as you listen to these facts about air travel, some of them tinged with a little bit of humor. 2. Check in with your body one more time now. Releasing anywhere that you're still holding on. And 1. Completely letting go now. As I tell you tonight's sleep story. Part 1. In which humanity looks up, makes notes about birds, and then jumps off things. The earliest history of human flight is mostly a history of people standing on tall structures, thinking very confidently, and then regretting everything within seconds. Before engines, before balloons, before anyone even thought to ask whether bones and feathers from a chicken were load-bearing, people began with the simple observation that birds could fly and people could not, and took that as a personal challenge. As far back as ancient China, long before tea was placed into bags or noodles were sold in cups, people made kites, paper, silk, bamboo, that soared into the air while their human creators remained firmly on the ground. Some early rulers, curious and with free access to prisoners, decided to strap people to kites to see if they might fly too. The general result was the kite flew beautifully. The human did not remain attached for very long, and no one wrote in diaries afterward about the experience in much detail. The ancient Greeks contributed more ambition than success. They told the tale of Daedalus and Icarus, who constructed wings made from feathers and wax. Whether or not this happened is debated, but historians agree on three things. Wax is not rated for aviation use, the sun is quite hot, and nobody kept the wings for museum display, so verifying any part of this story is difficult. The first serious documented attempt came from the 8th or 9th century Andalusian inventor Abbas ibn Firnas. He studied birds carefully, which mostly involved looking at them and deciding that their wings seemed important. He built a glider-like device from silk, wood, and feathers, climbed a specially constructed platform near Cordoba, and jumped. To the astonishment of onlookers, he did not fall straight down. He glided for what some accounts describe as a considerable distance, and others describe as a moment, perhaps two. Then he landed. Poorly. He injured his back and later concluded, quite seriously, that his crash occurred only because he forgot to include a tail. This would make him the first man in history to give a post-flight engineering review. Not to be outdone, in 11th century England, a Benedictine monk named Aylmer of Malmesbury watched the Halley's Comet, decided the world was ending, and, regarding this as perfect timing, tied handmade wings to his arms and feet. He leapt from the top of Malmesbury Abbey. He reportedly glided more than 200 meters before crashing and breaking his legs. When asked afterwards what went wrong, he did not blame his wings, his planning, or his judgment. He blamed the wind direction. Throughout medieval Europe, such attempts continued in much the same pattern. Clever idea, feathers, roof, disappointment. In France, Italy, and Germany, quiet inventors with more optimism than aerodynamics leapt from towers wearing contraptions made of wicker, parchment, or occasionally bed linen. These events were rarely written about in detail, except for brief lines like, "Brother Theodoric attempted to ascend," followed by, "Brother Theodoric will be resting for the foreseeable future." In Japan, performers in the Heian period briefly experimented with large fan-like structures to lift themselves in temple festivals. They did not fly, but they did land, mostly on their sides, sometimes with mild applause. Most historians now agree that during these centuries, humanity established three important conclusions about flight. Conclusion 1. Birds make it look easier than it is. Conclusion 2. Anything with feathers on it does not automatically constitute an aircraft. Conclusion 3. Gravity is both reliable and unsympathetic. And yet, in spite of bruised ribs, damaged abbey roofs, and an alarming shortage of feathers across Europe, one idea remained persistent. We could probably get this to work if we just climbed a little higher next time. Part 2, in which enormous bags of hot air are invented, and people immediately decide to stand inside them. While the previous centuries were filled with enthusiastic men leaping off monasteries wearing bird wings, the late 18th century marked a dramatic change. Instead of attempting to become birds, humanity briefly decided it would be easier to become laundry, and simply allow hot air to lift them skyward. This breakthrough came from two French brothers, Joseph Michel and Jacques-Étienne Montgolfier, owners of a family paper factory in Annonay. One evening in 1782, while watching laundry dry over a fire, one of them noticed that a shirt pocket puffed upwards. Rather than thinking, "That's a warm breeze," as any sensible person might, he thought, "We should probably build something enormous and climb inside it." And so they did. In June 1783, they unveiled a balloon made of paper and cloth, stitched and glued in their factory. It was painted blue and gold, because if one is going to defy nature and basic reason, one may as well do it tastefully. They filled it with hot air from a straw and wool fire. It rose a bit. Onlookers were impressed and concerned in equal measure. The French Academy of Sciences then asked the obvious question, "But can it carry living things?" The brothers, after a short meeting, decided not to test it using themselves. Instead, on the 19th of September 1783, before the gathered court of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette at Versailles, they placed a sheep named Mont au ciel, meaning climb to the sky, a duck, and a rooster into a small wicker basket beneath their balloon. It rose to 1,500 feet, drifted for 8 minutes, and landed without any significant emotional trauma to the sheep. The rooster was slightly annoyed due to having been stepped on by the sheep mid-flight. Encouraged by the fact that no animals had exploded, Etienne Montgolfier himself climbed aboard a second balloon on the 21st of November, 1783, alongside a gentleman named Jean-François Pilat de Rosier. who became history's first man to risk everything in a craft held together by fabric glue and optimism. They hovered above Paris for about 25 minutes, drifting gently while politely waving at confused chimney sweeps. Their landing was described as controlled, in the sense that they eventually stopped moving. Ballooning fever spread across Europe. In England, James Tytler, a man described by witnesses as having an alarming relationship with alcohol and hydrogen gas, built a balloon that lifted several feet before deflating onto a hedge. In Italy, Count Francesco Zambeccari tried adding fireworks to his balloon. Predictably, this went exactly as balloons plus fireworks usually go. Meanwhile, in France, people argued about whether smoke, hot air, or hydrogen was the correct substance for flight. One camp favored hydrogen because it was lighter than air. Another favored hot smoke because it smelled reassuringly like burning farm equipment. By the end of 1783, human flight was no longer an experiment. It was a fashionable inconvenience. Balloons were still impossible to steer, difficult to land, and liable to catch fire, but they were undeniably in the sky, which for most people was sufficient. It was at last possible to travel through the air, provided you didn't particularly care where you ended up. Part 3, in which balloons go up, continue going up, and nobody knows how to tell them to go anywhere else. Once balloons had been proven capable of lifting men, livestock, and the occasional slightly confused aristocrat, Europeans collectively decided that floating gently above fields was probably the future of transportation. What they did not decide, or even consider in any practical sense, was how to steer them. Early balloonists soon discovered that a balloon will go exactly where the wind wants it to go, and nowhere else. If the wind blew north, the balloon went north. If the wind stopped entirely, the balloon simply hovered like a large, uncertain fruit. There was no turning mechanism, no brakes, and no method of deciding which village, meadow, or cabbage field one might land in. Navigators attempted pointing in different directions, shouting left or leaning their bodies purposefully, but the balloon remained indifferent. This did not discourage anyone. Balloon flights became social events. Newspapers printed polite notices like, "On Thursday next, weather permitting, Monsieur Blanchard, shall ascend from the Tuileries Gardens, spectators are advised to arrive early and not to bring umbrellas with pointed ends. People gathered in thousands. They brought opera glasses, parasols, and bread. Some expected miracles, some expected disaster. What they usually saw was a man standing in a wicker basket, rising quietly, waving with mild uncertainty, and then disappearing awkwardly behind a cloud. Jean-Pierre Blanchard, one of the first professional aeronauts, brought along small dogs in balloons to release them with parachutes as a demonstration of safety. The dogs landed in nearby fields, reportedly perfectly fine, if slightly offended. Crowds applauded this, though it remains unclear whether they were celebrating science or gravity. The balloonists themselves kept journals. Many entries read like this: lifted off at 4:15 p.m. precisely, passed over several turnip farms. Peasants waved, landed unexpectedly in a vineyard, apologized to farmer. Tea was offered. Wind slower than hoped, hovered above a canal for some time, fishermen unimpressed. Forgot anchor, drifted farther than intended, landed near cheese market, cheese seller enthusiastic. As balloons grew more fashionable, some wealthy passengers insisted on bringing chairs, small tables, wine, and even parasols to shade themselves from non-threatening clouds. One gentleman brought a violin, although playing it proved difficult while ascending. Across Europe, theories spread about how to steer balloons. Some suggested enormous paddles. Others proposed eagles in harnesses. A Frenchman drew up plans for balloon oars to be dipped into the sky as one rows a boat upon a lake. No one built them, possibly because no one knew where the sky's waterline was meant to be. And so ballooning continued, gloriously impractical. They could lift people. They could travel great distances. But they went wherever the wind fancied, like slightly lost picnic baskets. It was peaceful. It was slow. And it was, much to everyone's surprise, technically flying. Part 4, in which people decide that floating aimlessly is not enough and begin to glide instead, very slowly and usually downwards. By the early 19th century, it became clear that balloons, while majestic and moderately impressive at garden parties, suffered from one significant drawback. They only went where the wind wanted. And so, once society had eaten enough balloon-related pastries and applauded enough politely drifting gentlemen, attention turned to a new idea. What if humans could travel through the air on purpose, This did not lead to engines or propellers, not immediately anyway. First it led to gliders. A glider is, essentially, something shaped like a bird that falls slightly slower than everything else. The first gliders were built by men who had spent many hours looking at birds and drawing diagrams of wings, often without asking the birds for input. They observed that wings were curved, so they tried curving things: wood, linen, paper, their own expectations. One of the earliest and most determined glider builders was Sir George Cayley, an English gentleman who lived in a large house and had both spare time and access to farmhands willing to sit in prototypes. Around 1804, he built what he called a governable parachute, which was a gentle way of saying slightly improved falling. Cayley correctly theorized 4 fundamental forces of flight: lift, weight, thrust, drag. Though at the same time, he could only reliably produce 3 of them. He constructed machines with fixed wings, detachable tails, and sometimes wheels. Most of them traveled a short distance downhill, paused, and then lay quietly in a field. One of his most reluctant test pilots resigned after gliding for a short distance and wrote a letter, now famous, saying, "Sir, I beg to resign my position with your flying apparatus. I was hired to drive, not to fly." Elsewhere, other innovators were taking very slow steps. In Germany, a man named Otto Lilienthal spent years studying storks and their wing shapes. He built gliders from willow, cotton, and unwavering optimism. He would run down hillsides, holding his glider above his head, then glide gracefully for several seconds before landing in grass, soil, or on one memorable occasion, a cabbage field. Spectators described it as surprisingly quiet. In France, engineers debated whether wings should flap like birds or remain still. After many lengthy discussions, they reached the conclusion, "We are not birds," and agreed not to flap anything. In Britain, amateur inventors wrote serious reports with titles like "On the Proper Angle at which one might leap from a gentle slope with an apparatus attached to the arms." These reports often ended abruptly. What gliders achieved was something subtle but important. For the first time, humans could leave the ground without a balloon and travel forward, not just upward and then down again. It was not dramatic, it was not fast, but it was deliberate. People could still not fly, but they could now fall with intent, and that was considered astonishing progress. Part 5, in which engines are added to gliders, and everyone pretends to be calm about it. By the late 19th century, gliders had become quite good at doing one thing: traveling gracefully downward. This was seen as encouraging, but also slightly inconvenient for anyone hoping to go upward instead. And so, after many meetings, sketches, and cups of lukewarm tea, a quiet yet revolutionary idea took shape. What if, they said, we attach an engine to it? This was not as straightforward as it sounds. Engines of the time were heavy, unreliable, and smelled faintly of oil and disappointment. They had been used in ships, factories, and occasionally to frighten horses, but never to make something fly. Still, the promise of sustained flight that did not depend on falling off hills was too tempting to ignore. Engine-powered flight began with men like Hiram Maxim, an American-born inventor living in England, known for inventing the machine gun, which for the sake of a sleep story we will not discuss. In the 1890s, he built a vast wooden flying machine with 2 steam engines and a wingspan longer than a tennis court. It never properly took off. It merely raced along a track, lifted a little, and then politely declined to continue. Maxim decided this was promising, but also expensive, noisy, and likely to ruin his lawn. Meanwhile, in Germany, Otto Lilienthal, who had spent years gliding off hills like a determined bird, began experimenting with adding light engines to his designs. He believed engines would make gliding less dependent on running downhill very fast. He was correct, but unfortunately his engines were not yet reliable, and his assistants were not yet convinced. At the same time, a French engineer with an excellent moustache, Clément Adet, built a bat-shaped aircraft called Éole in 1890. It had a steam engine, a large propeller, and looked exactly like something designed before anyone knew what airplanes were meant to look like. It reportedly lifted itself a few inches from the ground, traveled about 50 meters, and then stopped. Not due to disaster, but more due to indecision. Even though nothing stayed in the air for long, small things were being understood. Wings needed to be curved, not flat. Lifting off was not the same thing as flying, and propellers worked better when attached the right way round. Engineers developed new materials, lightweight wood stretched fabric, wire bracing, and something called the internal combustion engine, which, for the first time, offered enough power to lift a person without also weighing as much as a small horse. In France, Britain, and America, small workshops began to build experimental flying machines. They were given sensible names like Number 2 Glider, or ambitious names like the Aerial Steam Carriage. They were tested in fields, on beaches, and occasionally on purpose-built wooden rails. Some lifted briefly, some refused to move at all. None caused panic. And yet, slowly, something was happening. Ballooning had allowed people to float. Gliders allowed them to fall with grace. But now, for the first time, flight no longer depended on gravity or wind alone. It depended on engines. And engines, when they behaved, could run for hours. This did not yet produce an airplane, but it produced an idea that felt suspiciously close. Part 6, in which two brothers who fix bicycles decide to fix the sky instead. By the late 19th century, while many inventors were still attaching bits of canvas to steam engines and hoping for the best, two brothers in Dayton, Ohio, Wilbur and Orville Wright, were running a bicycle shop. They repaired wheels. They sold bells. They adjusted handlebars for people who complained that their bicycles pulled slightly to the left. In the evenings, after balancing accounts and oiling chains, the brothers read everything they could find about flight. They were not aristocrats, not scientists, and certainly not people who jumped off abbeys in feathers. They were, instead, methodical. They weighed things. They measured wind speed using homemade devices involving empty tin cans. They wrote letters to the Smithsonian asking for any available research papers on gliding, lift, and why so many brave Victorian men kept falling off hillsides. When they realized existing data on air pressure and wing lift was inaccurate, they calmly built their own wind tunnel. A small wooden box with a fan on one side, scales inside, and hundreds of test wing shapes carved by hand. They tested each wing shape, one by one, recording numbers in small handwriting. No feathers, no drama. By 1900, they traveled to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, a place that had 3 advantages. 1, strong winds. 2, soft sand for landing. 3, Very few witnesses in case it went badly. They brought their gliders there, assembled them on the sand, and took turns gliding a few feet above ground, jotting down observations such as drifts slightly to the right, or needs biscuit tin for counterweight. They realized the secret to flight was not just lift, but control. The ability to move the wings and tail slightly while in the air, rather than simply hoping for the best. To solve this, they invented wing warping, twisting the wings in opposite directions to turn left or right. They used a simple system of ropes and pulleys controlled by the pilot, shifting his hips. Very undramatic, very clever. They also added a front rudder to prevent the glider from wandering off in its own direction. By 1903, they added a lightweight petrol engine, purpose-built by their bicycle mechanic, Charlie Taylor. It produced just 12 horsepower, about the same as a modern ride-on lawnmower, but it was enough. On a cold morning of December 17th, 1903, Orville lay face down on the lower wing of their new flying machine, the Wright Flyer, on a rail track made of wood. Wilbur steadied the wingtip. They said nothing dramatic, probably something like ready and yes. Orville released the restraining wire. The machine moved forward, lifted, and stayed in the air for 12 seconds, traveling 120 feet, around the length of a small garden. It landed gently in the sand. There was no applause, no music, just the sound of wind and a man writing in a notebook. They took turns. First flight, 12 seconds. Second flight, 12 seconds. Third flight, 15 seconds. Fourth flight, 59 seconds. Nearly a whole minute of controlled, powered flight. When they went back to Ohio, no one believed them, largely because they were bicycle salesmen and not French balloonists in silk gloves. But they had done it. They had flown on purpose. And so powered flight began, not with trumpets or fireworks, but with two quiet brothers, a shed full of bicycle parts, and a very patient notebook. Part 7, in which airplanes become slightly less like garden furniture and slightly more like airplanes. After the Wright brothers proved that powered flight was possible if you had strong wind, soft sand, and quite low expectations for distance, the next logical step was to make airplanes that could fly for longer than the time it takes to boil an egg. This took a while. Early airplanes still looked like things someone might store in a barn behind a wheelbarrow. Wooden frames, fabric wings, and engines that sounded like lawnmowers clearing their throat. They were fragile, wobbly, and generally steered using ropes, hope, and a system of levers that made the entire aircraft feel like a slightly hostile deck chair. People began refining the design. Wings became stronger and were now covered in linen, a fabric treated with chemicals so it pulled tight and made a noise rather like a drum if you tapped it, though pilots were generally advised not to tap their own wings mid-flight. Engines went from 12 horsepower to 25, then 50, then 100, which was considered quite powerful, unless you were attempting to fly uphill. Landing gear evolved from skids to wheels, mostly so that pilots wouldn't have to explain every single time why their aircraft was stuck in a hedge. One of the first people to fly across anything more dramatic than a field was Louis Blériot, a Frenchman with an enormous moustache and no apparent regard for waterproofing. In 1909, he flew his aircraft, a Blériot 11 monoplane, across the English Channel. It took 36 minutes, during which he navigated using nothing more than a compass, a clock, and the theory that England was somewhere over there. He landed slightly harder than intended in a small field near Dover, and became instantly famous for achieving something that could no longer be described as gliding by accident. After that, flying schools began to appear. They were usually just fields with sheds, but they called themselves academies to sound respectable. Trainee pilots were taught important aviation skills, such as how to sit very still while airborne, how to avoid cows when landing in fields, and how to shout "switch off" before stepping in front of a moving propeller. Aircraft began to include seats with small cushions, not comfortable ones, just enough to make people feel that flying was not an entirely temporary activity. Wooden propellers became better balanced, meaning they were slightly less likely to fall off mid-air, a feature pilots appreciated. By the early 1910s, Flights could now last an hour or more. Some even carried passengers, usually friends of the pilot, or occasionally someone's employer who had said, "Go on then, impress me," and immediately regretted it. Onlookers gathered in fields, holding hats tightly to their heads, watching machines that climbed into the air at about the speed of a horse walking briskly. They clapped politely when the airplane landed, mostly out of relief. Still, everything remained gentle. Aircraft flew low. Speeds rarely exceeded 45 miles per hour. Tea was still considered more essential than parachutes. For the first time, flight was no longer just an experiment. It was becoming a mild, occasionally bumpy form of travel. And people began to ask a new question. Could ordinary people do this too? Perhaps without needing goggles, courage, or a spare field? The answer would take a little longer, but it was slowly, quietly, on its way. Part 8, in which people begin paying to be flown, letters take to the sky, and sheds are rebranded as airports. Once it became clear that airplanes could reliably travel several miles without falling apart or alarming livestock, someone inevitably asked, could we charge people for this? Thus, air travel, the paid kind, began. It started somewhat unheroically with mail, or post, depending on where you are. In 1911, in India, a pilot named Henri Piquet flew 6,500 letters, a distance of about 10 kilometers. The letters arrived slightly faster than by road. This was considered a success. Soon after, other countries began air mail services, which mostly consisted of one pilot, one bag of letters, and a field somewhere near the post office. Then slowly came passengers. The first ticketed passenger flight took place on January the 1st, 1914, when a man named Abram C. Fail, former mayor of St. Petersburg, Florida, paid $400, a large sum at the time, to sit beside pilot Tony Janus in a small flying boat. The flight lasted 23 minutes and traveled 21 miles across Tampa Bay. There was no cabin service. There were no seats, just a wooden bench and strong winds. Vail later described it as pleasant, which for early aviation was considered high praise. In Europe, similar things occurred. People in long coats and sensible shoes would approach a small shed beside a field, where someone with a notebook and hat would ask, "One way or return?" even if the concept of return flights was still theoretical. These early airports were rarely more than a field with reasonably short grass, a barn full of petrol cans and rope, a wooden hut with a desk and a sign that said something like Air Navigation Office, and a person writing names in a ledger very slowly. Aircraft seating was simple. One pilot in front, one passenger behind, sitting so close they could observe every bolt holding the wing in place. Safety features consisted of woolen coats and the ability to hold on to something. By the 1920s, more organized airlines emerged. KLM in the Netherlands, founded in 1919. Avianca in Colombia, founded in 1919. Qantas in Australia, 1920. Imperial Airways in Britain, 1924. Eventually to become British Airways. Their early routes were ambitious on paper, but involved many stops, tea, and occasional sheep on the runway. A flight from London to Paris might take 3 hours and involve one stop to check if the engine still sounded normal enough. Air travel was still considered adventurous, but no longer astonishing. Passengers received small folded timetables printed in blue ink. They wore goggles if the windows wouldn't close properly. They were sometimes handed a blanket if the altitude became uncomfortable, which it usually did. Airmail expanded rapidly. Letters that once took 3 days by train could now arrive within 24 hours by aircraft, assuming nobody ran out of fuel or got distracted by a hill. One postal report from 1922 dryly stated, "Delivery times are satisfactory. Complaints mostly regarding mud, wind, and lack of biscuits." And so, the world had reached a quiet milestone. Human beings could now send themselves and their letters through the air, not gracefully, not particularly quickly, but successfully enough to consider doing it again the following Tuesday. Part 9, in which airplanes grow up. War makes them faster, regrettably, and people begin flying in suits to places with pineapple. After those early days of canvas wings and passengers wearing goggles and mild regret, airplanes evolved steadily. Engines became more reliable. Aluminium replaced wood. Wings were designed using wind tunnels instead of guesswork. And someone finally said, "Perhaps we add seat cushions that are not made from wicker." The First World War arrived, and, without dwelling on it, it must be politely acknowledged that it pushed aviation forward rather quickly. Engines became stronger, navigation less vague, and aircraft could now take off without requiring a hill. Afterwards, commercial flight resumed with a new level of competence. By the late 1920s and 30s, passenger aircraft had enclosed cabins, heating, proper seats, and windows you could see through. Airlines advertised routes like London to Karachi, only 7 days, including tea breaks. Flying was still only for the wealthy, the brave, or those whose relatives worked for airlines. But it was no longer an eccentric hobby. It was a scheduled service with timetables, uniforms, and biscuits wrapped in paper. Then jet engines arrived, quietly humming their way into history. Originally developed for military purposes, which we will not linger on, the jet engine did something astonishing. It made airlines faster, smoother, and capable of flying above the weather, rather than directly through it while apologizing to passengers. By the mid-1950s, commercial jetliners like the de Havilland Comet and Boeing 707 appeared, and suddenly, impossibly, someone could have breakfast in New York and lunch in London, provided they didn't mind small windows and minor engine noise. Part 10, in which the 1960s arrive and air travel becomes an event worth polishing shoes for. The 1960s are often called the golden age of air travel, mostly by people who didn't have to pay for the tickets. Airports became glamorous buildings with glass walls, mechanical departure boards, and large clocks telling you the time in cities you'd only read about on postcards. Passengers arrived wearing hats, gloves, cufflinks, and a belief that flying was something almost magical. Flight attendants wore tailored uniforms in shades of navy, cream, or pale turquoise. They served meals on real plates, metal cutlery, linen napkins, and occasionally a slice of roast beef carved from a trolley. On longer flights, passengers could expect champagne, cigarettes, and possibly a small model airplane for the children, though the children were expected to remain silent. Aircraft interiors were decorated in browns, creams, and patterns that suggested someone in management had recently discovered color but didn't fully trust it. Overhead storage was minimal. People simply placed their suitcase in racks or left them in the aisle until someone asked politely for them to move them. In-flight entertainment consisted of looking out the window, reading magazines provided by the airline, typically titled Travel World Quarterly, or listening to music through fragile plastic headphones that crackled like frying oil and only worked in one ear. Seats reclined a polite few inches. Legroom was generous enough uppermost knees to exist unharmed. Smoking was allowed, and small ashtrays were built into the armrests, which no one found unusual. Airports proudly displayed signs like "Flying, the future of today," accompanied by posters of smiling families boarding aircraft with an optimism rarely seen before or since. People told their neighbors when they were flying somewhere, and the neighbors said things like, "Imagine, in the sky," as though discussing an exotic new vegetable. Flying was still expensive, still formal, still an occasion. The world felt both smaller and much, much wider. And up in the sky, small lights moved across the darkness, metal tubes filled with people sipping orange juice from proper glasses, unaware that one day, decades later, someone would be charged for extra legroom. Part 11, in which speed becomes glamorous, size becomes impressive, prices become surprisingly low, and air travel becomes mostly about queues. After the tidy optimism of the 1960s, air travel split its enthusiasm in several directions at once. Some people wanted to go much faster. Some wanted to carry far more people. And many wanted to go for much less money. The industry, being practical, decided to try all three, plus sandwiches in cling film. First, a respectful nod to speed. In 1976, a slender white aircraft with a pointed nose and a habit of bowing it for takeoff entered service. Concorde. It flew at twice the speed of sound, which is a number that looks impressive on a laminated fact sheet, and felt even more to some people who had lunch at 60,000 feet and arrived before their wristwatches had emotionally processed departure. The cabin was narrow, 2 seats on either side of a single aisle, the windows small, partly because there was not much time to look out of them before New York appeared. Meals were served on proper crockery. There were metal knives. Champagne made regular, unhurried appearances. Concorde's party trick was simple. London to New York in a shade over 3 hours, arriving with hair still basically where it started. The aircraft was quiet inside, brisk outside, and treated by its passengers as if they were borrowing the future and promising to return it in good condition. Meanwhile, size made its own entrance. In 1970, the Boeing 747, the jumbo jet, rolled up with a hump and an upstairs room that initially contained lounges where people sat on sofas and pretended the sky was a hotel lobby. airlines installed spiral staircases, bars, and, briefly, pianos, as if turbulence were a minor artistic inconvenience. Over time, the upstairs area mostly became a place for more seats, which is the fate of most interesting spaces in aviation. The 747's real achievement was logistical. It moved hundreds of people at once, quietly training airports to discover new emotions about luggage belts. Families crossed oceans in a single overnight hop, arriving with the distinct sensation that their shoes had expanded slightly. Airport departure boards gained extra character counts to fit the words Boeing 747 without abbreviations. Then came the era of entire houses in the sky. The Airbus A380, a double-deck aircraft all the way from front door to back door, entered service in the late 2000s and solved a problem no one had named publicly. What if boarding took a bit longer but felt impressively calm? Airports built dual air bridges. Gate agents acquired a new facial expression meaning upper deck passengers to the left, thank you. Inside, some airlines added quiet bars, a small staircase rail you could admire without touching, and, on certain routes, a shower, which passengers discussed for years afterwards in the tone usually reserved for a rare weather event. The A380's main talent, however, was silence. It was very large, very smooth, and gave people the uncanny feeling that speed had become gentle and distributed across 2 floors. While all this was happening overhead, prices on the ground did something interesting. In the United States, deregulation in the late 1970s allowed airlines to choose routes and prices more freely. A small carrier called Southwest demonstrated that if you use one aircraft type, turn it around quickly, and hand out schedules that look like bus timetables, people will fly more often without demanding chandeliers. Seats were unassigned. Boarding was orderly, chaotic, and the phrase on-time performance began to affect how sandwiches were cut. In Europe, during the 1990s, Ryanair and EasyJet applied similar logic. Plus, secondary airports that were near major cities in the geographical sense used by real estate brochures. Fares dropped, add-ons multiplied with admirable clarity, and passengers discovered that an airline could be both extremely punctual and curiously specific about baggage dimensions. The result? Weekend trips became normal. Boarding groups were invented, and priority became something one could purchase and then defend with quiet dignity while standing beside a stencil on the floor. And as we come to the end of this travel through the world of aviation, we can reflect on the modern miracle not being speed or size so much as predictability. A person can wake up, complete a sequence involving a bag, an app, 2 forms of identification, and a clear plastic wallet, and be delivered precisely on schedule to a city whose baggage carousel features the same yellow line advising everyone to stay back. The plane lands. A ripple of seat belts unclicking happens from front to back. A single overhead bin door refuses to close politely and must be pressed again. Passengers discover that row numbers are more conceptual than spatial when everyone stands at once. And yet, for all the queues and modestly priced sandwiches, the core experience remains as tidy as it is astonishing. You sit in a chair, and the ground goes away for a while. A long metal tube travels at cruise altitude. Cabin lights dim, and a small map shows you that you are between 2 places with certainty. Thus ends our incredibly dull history of air travel, from men in cloaks jumping off abbeys to boarding groups 1 to 5, from champagne at twice the speed of sound to a cup of tea at 36,000 feet that is, against all odds, hot, from lounges on upper decks to apps that say gate opens 14:20, with a confidence that calms entire families. These days it is less romantic, it is less heroic, it is more usefully highly organized, and in its meticulous, laminated way, it has succeeded. People go places. The sky, which began as a guess, is now a timetable.